ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. Namaste my dear friends. This is ninth video on Swami Ramsukhdasji's Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 6. The holy words of God had a singular effect and exerted a deep and far-reaching influence on Arjuna, as a result of which he starts doubting the correctness of his decision not to wear was. In such a state of mind, Arjuna says, verse 6, Ne chet dividya kartanno griyo yadva jayem yadivano jayeyuhu yanev hatvane jijivisam sate avasthita pramukhe dhartrashtraha. We don't know which is meritorious for us, to fight or not to fight, nor do we know whether we shall win or they will conquer us. The sons of Dhritarashtra, by killing whom we do not even wish to live, are arrayed against us. Na cheta advimaha katrar anno griha. I cannot decide whether I should wage war or not, because you consider it better to wage war, but I do not do so, as it is a sin to kill noble elders and preceptors. Yadva jayema yadivane jayeyuhu. If I carry out your order and wage war, we do not know whether we shall win or lose. Here it does not mean that Arjuna has no confidence in his own power, but he is uncertain about the future, because no one knows what may happen in future. Yaneva hatvana jiji vishmaha. Not to speak of pleasures and kingdom, we do not know even wish to live by killing our kinsmen, because by killing them we shall be bereaved of them and thus shall suffer pangs of bereavement. Te vasti mitah paramukhe dhritarashtraha. Dhritarashtra's sons are our kinsmen and they are arrayed against us. So how can we kill them? We are damned if we wish to live by killing them. Finding himself at the crossroads, Arjuna, being restless, prays to Lord Krishna. Stanza 7. कार्पण्ये दोषोपहत स्वभावः पर्छामि त्वां दृढं सम्भूढचेतः यच्छ्रेय शयान्ति निश्चितं ब्रूहि तन्मे शिष्य अस्ते अहं शाधि मां त्वां प्रपन्नम्. My nature is overwhelmed with the vice of faint-heartedness, and my mind is confused with regard to my duty. I entreat you, tell me what is decidedly good for me. I am your disciple. Do instruct me, who have taken refuge in you. Comment. कार्पण्ये दोषोपाह वभैस्वः पृच्छमि त्वं धर्मा सम्मोधचेतः. Arjuna did not think it desirable to turn away totally from the war, but to escape the sin, he did not find any other alternative, so he wanted to turn away from war, and he thought of such action as a virtue rather than a vice of faint-heartedness. But when Lord Krishna called his action faint-hearted and unmanly, Arjuna was reminded of his duty as a member of the warrior class for whom it was not befitting to run. So Arjuna, by conceding his faint-heartedness, says that first his nature, even as a member of the warrior class, was weighed down with the weakness of faint-heartedness, and secondly, his mind was confused with regard to his duty. Being overpowered by delusion, he could not take the right decision about its righteousness. In the third verse, Lord Krishna advised Arjuna, cast off your petty faint-heartedness and stand up for war. So his doubt should have been removed, but he still had some doubt because on the one hand he thought that it was a sin to kill the kinsman and the adorable elders, but on the other hand, being a member of the warrior class, it was his duty to wage war. So he was confused with regard to his duty, and he entreats Lord Krishna to tell him what his real duty is. Yat Shreya Shayani Stitam Bruhi Tanmi. In the second verse of this chapter, Lord Krishna told him that his dejection was a shame and it should be shunned by noble souls. So Arjuna thought that he should also follow the path adopted by noble souls. Therefore he prays to Lord Krishna to tell him what is decidedly good for him. First Arjuna was agitated and distressed, and he asks what was good for him. It shows that an awakening for salvation as a goal is not aroused in a man so long as he is satisfied with his present situation. But when he is dissatisfied and he wants to rise above it, he becomes aware of his real aim, that is salvation. Shishyaste ahem. When Arjuna entreated Lord Krishna to tell him what was decidedly good for him, he thought that such a question could be put to a teacher, not to a chariot driver. Arjuna's conviction that he was a chariot warrior while Krishna was his charioteer, whom he ordered to place the chariot between the two armies, had gone. So he becomes his disciple and declares, I am your disciple, so tell me what is decidedly good for me. Sabhi Sabhimam Tvam Prapannam. Arjuna thinks that the preceptor can guide the disciple, and a disciple will have to shoulder the responsibility to translate his teachings into practice and then make effort to attain salvation. But he wants to hand over this responsibility to his preceptor as the mother of a breast sucking child, not the child who falls sick, takes medicine for his recovery. The teacher takes over responsibility of the disciple who takes refuge in him. So Arjuna, by depending on the teacher and surrendering to him, says, I have taken refuge, refuge in you, instruct me. Here Arjuna, by using the phrase Tvam Parpannam, says that he has taken refuge in him, but actually he had not taken completely refuge in him. Had he done this, he would not have uttered the words instruct me, because a disciple has no responsibility of his own. The full responsibility lies with the teacher. Secondly, in the ninth verse he says, I shall not fight. It shall show, it also shows that he had not really taken refuge in him. Otherwise, he might have not uttered these words. A disciple who takes refuge in his teacher has no say, no responsibility of his own. He becomes merely an instrument in the hands of his preceptor and does whatever his teacher wants him to do. Therefore, Lord Krishna in the 66th verse of the 18th chapter says, seek refuge in me alone. Then Arjuna in the 73rd verse of the 18th chapter says, I shall act according to your word. It is here that Arjuna really takes refuge in him. In this verse, there are 4 points spoken by Arjuna which need attention. 1. My nature is weighed down with the voice of faint-heartedness, and I entreat you because my mind is confused with regard to my duty. 2. Tell me, he entreats what is decidedly good for me. Third, I am your disciple. Fourth, instruct me who has taken refuge in you. If we think over these 4 points one by one, we realize that as far as the first point is concerned, the person to whom the question is asked is free, whether he answers the question or not. The second point shows that it is his duty to answer. In the third, the responsibility to guide the disciple so that he may attain salvation is that of the teacher. In the fourth, the full responsibility for salvation of the disciple is the teacher's. In the previous verse, Arjuna takes refuge in Lord Krishna, but he thinks that Lord Krishna wants him to wage the war, which he regards as unrighteous, and so he will again order him to wage war. Secondly, he thinks that perhaps he has not been able to convey his feelings to him. So, in the next verse, Arjuna clearly expresses his feelings to him against the war. Stanza number 8. Nehi parpashyami mam apnudyadah yachokamo indriyanam evape bhuma vaspatnam mirdham rajam suran apchadhipatyam. Even on obtaining undisputed sovereignty and an affluent kingdom on this earth, as well as lordship over the gods in heaven, I do not see any remedy that can remove my grief, which withers my senses. Arjuna thinks Lord Krishna wants him to wage war so that he may gain victory and kingdom, and thus his grief may be removed. But he is so grief stricken that even the joy of victory is not likely to remove his grief. Evapya bhuma vasmapat nam riddham rajam. Even if I obtain an undisputed sovereignty and affluent kingdom on this earth, and my subjects become happy and prosperous, and I may have no enemy on the face of earth, it will fail to remove my grief. Sura namapi Chadhipatayam, not to talk of worldly pleasure, even lordship of Indra, the king of the gods, over the gods cannot remove my worry and grief. In verses 32 and 33 of the first chapter, Arjuna wanted to turn away from war because of his attachment for his kinsman, but here he wants to turn away from war because he thinks that it is an obstacle to salvation. So there is a lot of difference between the two situations. Nahi prapashyami mam panyudyad yacha okam mucha spana mindriyanam. How sad I shall become after the death of my kinsman when I am so much grieved after thinking of it. If I grieved over the loss of a kingdom, it might be overcome by gaining it, but I am grieved at thinking of the massacre of my kinsmen. If I gain a kingdom, it will rather enhance my grief, because who could enjoy the kingdom after the death of my kinsman? Therefore, undisputed sovereignty and an affluent kingdom on this earth and lordship over the gods cannot remove the grief that is parching my senses. What Arjuna did after saying that even possession of material objects would not relieve him of his grief is contained in the verse that follows. Stanza number 9. Sanjay Ovach एवं उक्त्वा ऋषिकेशं गौडाकेशः परन्तप नो युतस्य इति गोविंद मुक्त्वा तूष्णीं बभुः. Sanjay said, O scorcher of enemies, after addressing the indwelling Lord, thus Arjuna, the conqueror of sleep, said to him, I will not fight, and became silent. Comment. Eva muktva hirsikesam guddhakesh parnitpanaय yotasya iti govindam muktva tushnim babhuah. Arjuna honored the Lord's word and wanted to obey it, but after thinking seriously over what Lord Krishna had said and applying his own mind to his thoughts, came to the conclusion that war could result in providing him with an affluent kingdom, honor and fame, but it would not wipe out his grief, worry and misery. Therefore, it was not befitting for him to wage war. So Arjuna speaks his mind in clear words, I will not fight. Having declared his decision not to fight and having nothing more to say, Arjuna became quiet. In the next verse, Sanjay describes what happened when Arjuna flatly refused to fight. Stanza 10. तमोवाच ऋषिकेश परहसन्यो भारत सेनयोर उभयो मध्ये विसीदंत इदम वचः. O Bharata, Dhritarashtra, born in Bharata dynasty, Sri Krishna, as if smiling, addressed the following words to the despondent Arjuna while in the midst of the two armies. Comment. तमोवाचा ऋषिकेशः परमहंसा निवा भारता सेनार्योर भयो Madhye Visidhan Middam Vachaha. Arjuna, filled with valor and enthusiasm, had entreated Lord Krishna to place his chariot between the two armies so that he could behold the warriors. It was befitting for Arjuna to get ready for fighting, which was his objective. But there, instead of waging war, he felt grieved, so Lord Krishna started the gospel of the Gita. Pramhansa Niva, smiling as it were, means that when Lord Krishna perceived that Arjuna's enthusiasm for the war had changed into grief, he smiled. Secondly, in the 7th verse, he said, Do instruct me who have taken refuge in you. But in the 9th verse, he says, I will not fight. So Lord Krishna smiled because the devotee who takes refuge in his preceptor just becomes an instrument in the hands of his preceptor, and a preceptor is fully responsible for the duty of the disciple. The disciple has no option but to obey his preceptor and do as his teacher wishes. Arjuna's declaration not to fight is practically a withdrawal from his refuge in the Lord. Aiva means that Lord Krishna must have burst into laughter after hearing Arjuna's decision of not fighting, but he spoke smilingly. When Arjuna said, I will not fight, Lord Krishna should have told him to do as he wished. But he thought that Arjuna was unable to take the right decision because he was overwhelmed with grief and worry. So there was an overflow of Lord Krishna's love for him. God, instead of paying attention to the words of his devotees, judges them by their feelings. So, Lord Krishna, instead of paying attention to Arjuna's words, I will not fight, started the gospel from the next verse. Moreover, he accepts those devotees who take refuge in him, even by words as his own, because of his boundless grace. Hrishikesa means that the Lord is the indweller which he knows feelings of beings. Lord Krishna knows that Arjuna is turning away from war because he is overpowered by the urge of attachment for his kinsman, and he does not see his grief melting away by merely acquiring a kingdom. So he says, I will not fight, but he also knows that as soon as his delusion is destroyed, he will act upon his instruction. In idam vachaha uvacha, the use of the word uvacha, spoke, was sufficient. There was no need to use the word vachaha, word, because vacha is also included in uvacha. It seems a repetition, but actually it is not so. The word vachaha has been used to point out the secret wisdom contained in the next verse uttered by Lord Krishna in simple and easily understandable language. Appendix on the sacred righteous soil of Kurukshetra. On one side the Kaurava army is arrayed, while on the other side the Pandava army is arrayed. In the middle of the two armies, a glorious chariot drawn by white horses is placed. In one part of the chariot, Lord Krishna is seated, while in another part, Arjuna is seated. The Lord starts preaching the divine gospel for the benediction of mankind by making Arjuna an instrument, and first of all he describes the discrimination between the body and the embodied soul, its possessor. Lord Krishna preaches the gospel of freedom from grief to grieved Arjuna and says, Sri Bhagwan Uvacha, stanza number 11. असोचा अन सोच त्वम पर्यावादास्व भाससे गतासुंश्च न सोचन्ति पंडितः. The blessed Lord said, Arjuna, you grieve for those who should not be grieved at. You yet speak as if a man of wisdom. The wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. Comment. A man is grieved when he classifies objects and persons into two divisions, one's own and not one's own, such as our kinsman and not our kinsman, of our caste and not of our caste, of our stage of life and not of our stage of life, our followers and not our followers. We have a sense of mind, attachment, love and desire for those who we regard as ours. Through these, a sense of mind and desire, etc., for such grief, worry, fear, perturbation, commotion, and strain, etc., arise. The root of all faults is a sense of mind and desire, etc. This is a rule. At the beginning of the Gita, Dhritarashtra asked, what did my sons and the sons of Pandu do? It shows his partiality towards his own sons and attachment for them, though the Pandavas regarded him more than their father. Arjuna also developed the same attachment, but he had no partiality. He was impartial, and so he uses the terms seeing all these relations. And how can we, by killing our own kinsmen, be happy? Chapter 1, stanza number 37. It means that Arjuna had attachment for the Kuru family, and because of possibility of destruction of the family, he was grieved. To remove this grief, Lord Krishna preaches the Gospel of the Gita, which begins with this 11th verse. In the end, Lord Krishna declares that there is no justification for him to grieve and he should take refuge in him alone and not grieve. Grieve not. Chapter 18, stanza 66. The reason is that dependence on the world leads to grief, while supreme or exclusive devotion to the Lord leads to the state which is free from faults such as grief and worry, etc. Asociya nan vaso Ch.2. There are two things in the world, real and unreal, the soul and the body. Both of these are not be grieved as the real is imperishable and therefore should not be grieved for, and the unreal is bound to perish as it is perishing every moment, so it should not be grieved at. It means that these are grieved at only because of ignorance or lack of discrimination. Whatever circumstances in the form of birth, death, profit, loss, etc., a man finds himself in are result of his fate with his previous actions. It is sheer ignorance to feel happy or sad in those favorable or unfavorable circumstances because these are transient. Prajna Vad Maschaya Bhasha se. On the one hand, you speak words of wisdom, but on the other hand, you grieve. It shows that you are merely talking tall. Actually, you are not wise because the wise do not grieve for anyone. You also say that with the destruction of a family, its age-old traditions disappear, women becomes depraved, and these and there ensues an intermixture of caste which leads to hell and deprived of the ritual offerings of rice balls, pinda, and water. Their means also fall. These words, as of the wise, also prove that a body is perishable, while the soul is imperishable. Had the soul not been imperishable, how could you have feared the fall of the killers and members of the family? Further, you would not have worried about the fall of mange. You worry and fear prove that a body is perishable while its master, the soul, is eternal. So it is not right to grieve for them. Gata, Suna, Gata, Sumascha. It is our ignorance that you grieve for the bodies because these will all perish. You should not lament for them. Such grief is a mistake. It is also a great mistake to grieve for those who are dead because they suffer torture. If their people grieve for them, the departing soul has to drink and eat the tears and phlegm shed by people here. Similarly, we should not grieve or worry for those who are living because grief, worry does not help them in any way. We should rather care for and help them. Arjuna's limbs were giving way and his mouth was getting parched. The root of such feelings is his identity with the body. Such identity creates affinity for those who nurse this body. That affinity gives birth to grief and worry in thinking of their death. So one is grieved, worried, and sad after thinking of those who are living as well as those who are dead. One is grieved, worried about the dead because deprived of the ritual offerings of rice balls and water. The man's heavy downfall. Chapter 1, stanza 42. And he is worried about the living ones because they are arrayed on the battlefield, staking their lives and property. Chapter 1, stanza 33. Both types of worries relate to their bodies, so they are of the same character. The departing soul has to eat and drink the phlegm and tears shed by the relative, so we should not lament the death of a relative but should perform obsequies. Panchatantra, Mitra Bheda 365. The departing soul hereafter drinks the tears shed by the relatives here. Sakanda Purana Brahma Setu. Instead of grieving for those who are dead, we should offer ritual water and rice balls, etc. because it is our duty. Similarly, we should make arrangement to care for those who are living. So we should give a serious thought to it which enables us to understand our duty. While worry, grief destroys the power of thinking. Nanu some anti pandita. Discrimination between the real and the unreal is called panda, wisdom, and one who has developed discrimination is known as pandita, wise. Such wise men do not grieve because they can discriminate between the real and the unreal, the imperishable self, soul, and the perishable body. Grief arises only when the unreal is accepted as real. That is when there is a desire to maintain the body forever. For the real, there is no grief or worry at all. Appendix. There is one division of the body, Sarira, while another division is of the self, Sarira. Both have no relationship at all with each other. Both are quite different in nature. One is insentient while the other is sentient. One is perishable while the other is imperishable. One is mutable while the other is immutable. One is kaleidoscopic while the other remains the same for time immemorial. Bhuta Grammaha as Aveyam. Gita 8 chapter 19th stanza. सर्जे पौन पाजायन्ते परलयेन व्याहन्ति च गीता 14th chapter 2nd stanza. The body and the self both are not to be grieved. The body ever perishes, therefore it is not to be grieved, while the self never perishes, therefore it is also not to be grieved. One is grieved only because of one's own folly. The body is continuously separating automatically while the self is ever attained to all. The wise men who know this distinction between the body and the self never grieve for any being, whether dead or alive. Never grieve for any being, whether dead or alive. In their view, the division of the changing body is different from that of the never changing self, that is the ever existent entity. The gospel of the Gita begins with the discrimination between the body and the self. Other philosophical classics describe the self and the non-self as an objective manner, and it becomes a matter of study. But the Gita, instead of describing the self and non-self objectively, describes deha, dehi, sarira, sariri, body and its owner on the basis of the personal experience of all person. This is uniqueness of Gita. The striver who wants to attain salvation first of all must know who I am. Arjuna has also asked Lord Krishna to tell him the highest good for him. Gita, 2nd chapter, 7th stanza. Salvation can only be attained by discriminating the self from the body. So long as a man holds I am body, he may listen to gospels, may preach gospels to others, may practice spiritual discipline, but salvation is not possible. It is a blunder to accept, assume a thing which is not one's own as one's own, and to disown a thing which is one's own. Only the thing which may ever live with us and with which we may ever live can be our own. The body in the same state does not stay with us even for a moment while God ever lives with us. The reason is that the body belongs to the class of the world while the self belongs to the class of God. Therefore, it is the greatest blunder to assume the body as one's own and not to assume God as one's own. In order to rectify this blunder, the Lord in the Gita first of all describes the discrimination between the body and the self and awakens the striver to the fact that you self are not the entity which dies with you are not the body. You are the knower while the body is the known. The Gita 13th chapter, first stanza. You are eternal and pervade everywhere. Nityaha Sarvagataha. Gita, second chapter, 24th stanza. Yena Sarvamidam Tatam. Gita, second chapter, 17th stanza. While the body is omnipresent. You are a resident of the divine world while the body is a resident of the matter, mortal world. You are a fragment of God. Mama Vamso, Jivaloke, Gita, 15th chapter, 7th stanza. While the body is a fragment of Prakriti, nature, Manaha, Sasthan Indriyani, Prakriti Sthani. Gita, 15th chapter, 7th stanza. You ever live in immortality, while the body ever lives in mortality. By the decay and death of the body, you don't decay and die in the least. Therefore, you should not be obsessed by grief, worry, and fear, etc. The self is not attached and limited to anybody, therefore, it is said to be pervading everywhere. Sarvagataha, Gita, second chapter, 24th stanza. Yana Sarvamidam Tatam, Gita, second chapter, 17th stanza. Therefore, the true nature of a striver is merely an ever existent entity, not a Sriri, one having a body, rather, it is a Sriri having no relation with the body. Therefore, the Lord has also designated it as a Vyakti, unmanifest. Gita, second chapter, 25th stanza. Avyakti Dini Bhutani, unmanifest beings. Second chapter, 28th stanza. The body is decaying every moment and it is asat. Asat has no existence. Na asto vidyate bhava. Second chapter, 16th stanza. How a striver having relationship with the body, even whose existence is not there can be termed Sariri. A striver is neither Sarira body nor Sariri Dehi. In this section, the Lord has used the term Sariri Dehi for the ever existent entity in order to explain it to the strivers. By calling it as Sariri, he means to say that a striver is not body. When we reflect upon the nature of the body and the self, we perceive that the body and the self have their own identity, and when we don't reflect upon them, then they have also their own identity. On reflection, there is no difference in the reality of their true nature, but by reflecting upon them, the striver's delusion is destroyed and the human life becomes successful by attaining its aim. In human life, there is predominance of discrimination. Therefore, I am not body. This discrimination is possible only in the human body. The sense of I and mine in the body is not the work of human intellect, but that of beastly intellect. Therefore, Sri Sukadevji Maharaj says to King Parikshit, त्वं तो राजन् मरिष्येति पशु बुद्धिमी महाजाहि न जातः प्रज्ञाभूतो दया देहावत्तं न मनुष्यसि. Srimad Bhagavat. O King, Now give up this beastly intellect that you will die, as the body was not existent in the past, it was born afterwards and will die in future. It is not the case with you. The self that you were non-existent in the past were born afterwards and will die in future. In the next two verses, the Lord explains why it is unwise to grieve for what is imperishable. Stanza number 12. ने तवेवाहं जातु नाशम ने त्वं नेमे जनाधिपः ने चैव ने भविष्यामः सर्वे वयमतः परम्. In fact, there was never a time when I or you or those kings were non-existent, nor is it right that we shall cease to be in future. Comment. There are two things in the world, the soul, the real, and the body, the unreal. And both of these are not to be grieved for, because the soul never ceases to be and the body is ever perishable. So here it is explained that the soul is immortal while the body is mortal. न तवे व जातु न श्रीम न त्वम नेमे janadhipaha. People think that I did not exist before my incarnation and you and these kings were also non-existent before our birth. But it is not so. All of us certainly existed because the real is always existent, unaffectedly time, place and circumstances, etc. I, you, and these kings had their previous existence. This declaration could suffice, but contrarily, it is said, I, you, and these kings had no such pre existence. This is not true. The reason is that by the latter expression, that there was no such pre existence is not true. The fact of their pre existence is emphasized. It means that the real is eternal. It was never a not. By the term Jatu, the Lord means to say that in all times, past, present, and future, and in all climates, circumstances, states, incidents, and things, etc., this real never ceases to be ever. Here, by using the word Ahem, Lord Krishna identifies himself with other people in order to explain that the real never ceases to be. While in the fifth verse of the fourth chapter, Lord Krishna says, you and I have taken many births. I know them all, while you do not, which shows that he as the Lord is different from other. In the fifth verse of the fourth chapter, the Lord expresses his excellence, eminence and glory as compared to ordinary mortals. While in this verse he expresses his unity with the soul of common man. न चैवा ne bhavishyamoh sarve vyamataha param. In future, the bodies will not continue to be the same and one day they will perish, but the soul will never cease to be because the real is eternal. It was neither non-existent in the past nor will be in future. Lord Krishna has talked about the past and the future by saying that there was never a time when they were non-existent nor they will cease to be, but he has not talked about the present because they are clearly seen at present through the bodies. In their present existence there is no trace of doubt, but if we think seriously we come to know that we the soul exist at present but the bodies are kaleidoscopic. Therefore, we should realize that the soul is different from the bodies because we have our existence at present as we had in the past and we will have in future while the bodies are perishable. A man realizes his existence before sleep and after sleep, but he has his existence during sleep also. Ever while his body is undergoing changes every moment and it will perish one day. Similarly, the bodies of all of us, I, you, and these kings did not exist in the past nor will exist in future and presently also. perishing every moment, but our self existed in the past, will exist in future and exist now. Our entity is transcendental as we living subject, no time, present, past and future objectively. Subject is always distinct from object. Thus the Lord has spoken this verse to explain this transcendental entity of the self, an exceptional fact. Lord Krishna in this verse says that the bodies are perishable while the self is imperishable. It is a rule that what exists in the beginning and the end also exists in the middle, and what does not exist in the beginning and the end does not exist in the middle either. But the question arises that how in the middle these bodies are visible. The answer is that senses, mind and intellect with which we see and worldly objects which are seen, both are perishable and change every moment. Man self identifies himself with the seen, then he is called a seer. When the instruments of perception and the objects of perception are all perishable and transient, then how can the apparent onlooker be permanent? The apparent entity of a seer onlooker is there because of affinity between the seer, the senses, and the seen. In case there is no such affinity, then this apparent entity of the seer fades away, but the base of the apparent entity, which is truth, persists. The truth is called the base of creation, preservation, destruction, and illuminator of all seeing entities. These names base and illuminator are only in relation to objects which they base and illumine. In the absence of those objects, the truth ever remains as it is. He who has an eye for the truth can never grieve. This way, I, you, and these kings are not to be grieved at all. Appendix. In this verse, there is the description that God and the self both are endowed with the same characteristics. The Lord declares, I as Krishna, you as Arjuna, and all these people as kings neither existed in the past nor will exist in future, but all of us are ever existent entity existed in the past and will also exist in future. It means that I, you, and these kings, these these three are different as far as the bodies are concerned, but they are the same as far as the self is concerned. The bodies neither existed in the past nor will exist in future, but the entity of the soul self did exist in the past, shall exist in future, and does exist at present. When these bodies did not exist, the entity of the self was there, and when these bodies will cease to exist, that entity will still remain. There is nothing else except one ever existent entity. I, you, and these kings. By saying so, the Lord means that the entity of God and entity of the embodied self are one and the same, which in is and am there is only one pure consciousness. It is because of I, ego, that am is used. If there is no affinity for I, ego, then am will not remain, but only is will remain. That is with pure consciousness rather than the body is our true identity. Therefore, one should not grieve for the body as an incident of the past, and the future is perceived far away, so also is an incident of the present. The reason is that as we, the self, have no connection with the past and the future, similarly, we have no connection with the present. When we, the self, have no connection at all with them, then what is the difference between the past, the future, and the present for us? These three are within limits of time, but the self transcends the limits of time. Time has divisions while the self is eternal and indivisible. It is only by regarding the body as self that there appears difference between the past, the future, and the present. In fact, the past, the future, and the present don't exist for the self, it being eternal. Many ages may change, yet Shariri, the self, does not undergo any change. It remains the same because it is a fragment of God. But the body does ever change. It does not remain the same even for a moment. Stanza number 13. देहिनो अस्मि अन्यथा देहे कौमारम यौवनम जरा तथा देहा अंतर प्राप्ति धीर सत्र नो मुह्यते. Just as boyhood, youth, and old age changes in this physical body do not affect the soul, likewise is the change to another body. Wise man never gets disturbed about this. At this stage, I complete this video. Next video number 11 will continue with stanza number 13. Thank you for watching this video. Namaskar, my dear friends. Thank you.